Today we'll talk about manure management, but whether your small farm has just a few chickens, 20 head of beef cows, or a couple of horses, if you have livestock, you're going to have manure. So we'll talk about how you can manage that manure so that it can be a resource for you rather than a problem for you and your neighbors. So we'll cover the importance of manure management, manure impacts and the regulations especially, and then we'll look at the production, the handling, and the application so that we're utilizing it beneficially. So your first question might be, why should I worry about manure management? It's a natural product, right? And a lot of times you'll hear that manure is a resource. It is. It's a good resource if it's managed well. Good manure management helps protect our environment. It can help keep our livestock and pets healthy. And ideally, we're utilizing those nutrients in a beneficial manner. We're not just dumping them in a garbage can and hauling them to the landfill, although that can be environmentally safe. And manure can help improve our soil, and good manure management will help you have good neighbor relations. And believe me, bad neighbor relations are not a good thing. Poor manure management, on the other hand, is just the opposite. You're going to typically get reduced livestock performance and health. If they get diseases, it tends to spread throughout the whole herd. It can impact human health, especially some of the E. coli, Listeria, and some of those diseases. You tend to end up with increased pest populations, which also means for usually grouchy neighbors. And you oftentimes, when you have poor manure management, we end up with some environmental degradation. That manure is leaving your property and getting into waters of the state, and that can result in fines and violations. And that's nothing any of us want. So, and probably one of the worst parts is our neighbor complaints. If you have a small farm, chances are good that you live close to a city or within city limits, and neighbors will probably be closer than if you have a great big large farm. And neighbors can be really helpful and fine, or if they don't like your livestock, and especially if they don't like your manure management, they're going to probably complain about the odor, the insects, flies especially, rodents. In our drier climate, dust can be a huge issue. And oftentimes they might complain about the aesthetics. So if you place your manure pile in your, so that it's in the back, but where your neighbors can see it from their backyard as they sit on their deck, they are probably not going to be happy. Most people don't think of a manure pile as being scenic and beautiful. And that manure can then end up with runoff, and that can create more problems and more neighbor complaints usually. When we have runoff, it can create some environmental impacts. Then it's really the nutrients in the manure that cause the biggest problem. And those nutrients, when it gets into our waters, can help create a lot of algae growth. We can get that green algae growing on the lakes and stuff. But especially in Utah, we're seeing more and more harmful algal blooms. Those are when we have too many nutrients and warm temperatures. The algae that like to grow are ones that produce toxins, and those toxins can kill livestock, it can kill pets. It is harmful to humans, so we can't use our recreational areas. And algal blooms, whether or not they're harmful algal blooms, can result in fish kills. And so we're trying to minimize those nutrients getting into our water sources. Those nutrients can come from many, many sources, not just farms and not just agriculture. It can be from manure, can be from fertilizer, and that can be from farms, but it can also be from our homeowners. As they apply fertilizer to the yards, oftentimes they apply more than they need. It can be from failing septic systems, and then realize that all of our municipalities, even though they have permits and they're following them, they are also allowed to release a low level of nutrients, and those also can get into our water sources. When we start looking at the regulations, EPA controls federal waters. Our state mimics them for any water of the state. And a water of the state is any water that leaves your property is considered a water of the state. But basically the regulation is that no, you cannot have any discharge of manure into a water of the state. And that there's no minimum amount. A tablespoon of manure into a water of the state is technically a violation. There's also no minimum number of animals. So if you have 1 or 2 chickens and manure getting into the water of the state, technically you could be fined. Now, you're not likely to be, but they don't have any minimums because they are trying to control all of that and prevent nutrients from getting into our waters of the state. Now, there is a grazing exemption. And so if you have livestock and a pasture, and your pasture has a water source going through it, a little stream, you are allowed technically to let your livestock access that water, especially for drinking water. And that is legal. There's some caveats to that, though. You have to maintain what is called adequate and desirable vegetation. That's very subjective based on who the inspector is. Our inspector is Don Hall right now. And his guidelines is that generally you should have a minimum of 4 inches of desirable vegetation throughout the pasture. Now that's a minimum. That's not a maximum of 4 inches in one spot or 2 spots. That's a minimum, and it needs to be desirable vegetation. Weeds don't meet that exemption. As we look at this picture, although it looks fairly green, this one probably does not technically meet that grazing exemption because that grass does not look like it's a minimum of 4 inches all the way across. And this is another example. The grass, I don't know if you can see my pointer on to the right of the horse. It's tall, but the rest is non-existent. That tall grass doesn't exempt that as a pasture. This would absolutely fail the grazing exemption. So, but just in general, it is better if we can keep our livestock out of our water sources. You can fence it off back a few feet or a little ways, and then just let the livestock in there to graze occasionally for just a few short days. And that way you are reducing a lot of the manure and fecal matter that gets into that water source. And there are studies that show that when they look at the DNA, I believe it's the Chesapeake Bay, and they're looking at the DNA associated with the fecal matter, about 56% was from humans, and about 20% was from beef cows, and it was primarily ones that were in pasture settings where they had access to the water. Now, you might be saying, but I only have a few little animals. They can't be much of a problem, right? So you have 3 little goats or maybe 2 horses. We're going to take a quick look at how much manure those animals produce. If we have 2 horses, 12 chickens, or 2 dogs. So there are books that give you tables with the average amount of manure produced per day, both in weight, volume, and the moisture content. This will vary based on your animals, the diet you feed them, but it's a really good starting point. And at the end, I have a link that will show you, that will take you to some of those sources. So for our 2 horses, and I'm not going to go through the math, but we are going to produce almost 20 tons of manure per year. That is a lot. And that's just the manure. That's not including the bedding. If we add bedding, we can expect to double the volume. That's a really good, just general rule of thumb, that bedding will double the volume, not necessarily the weight, but the volume. So with the bedding, we can expect our horses to produce 24 tons of waste per year that totals more than 2,100 cubic feet. That's a lot. And you have to have a place or a way, a mechanism to deal with that. Chickens are much smaller, don't produce nearly as much waste, and it tends to compact more, but you're still going to end up with, if you have 12 chickens, about 1,000 pounds of waste and about 24 cubic feet. And dogs, if you have just 2 dogs, you might think, oh, that's, that's non-existent. 2 dogs at about 66 pounds each are going to produce almost a ton of waste per year. Now, you may not think of it every day as you're scooping up or picking up waste, but that's a lot. And as I scoop out my kitten's litter box, I'm like, how can you possibly produce so much? But all animals, all mammals produce waste, and we need to figure out how to deal with that. So let's look at the production settings and where we're getting it and how we can handle that. The easiest by far is if you have a pasture. If you have cows in a pasture, that's really, for the most part, super easy, right? Those animals are out there eating that grass, those nutrients are being recycled back onto the grass, and you aren't having to scoop it up. You aren't having to clean out sheds and stalls. You aren't having to spread it. If you have cows, you may occasionally go drag the pasture to break up the cow patties and help spread those nutrients a little bit. But the big issue here really is just the deposition of that manure. If we have livestock accessing the waterway directly as they enter and leave that water stream, cows tend to defecate, and so they're pooping into that water, which can be a problem. The other thing to just realize on that is in a pasture, only about 10% of that pasture each year will receive a urine or a fecal spot. That means 90% of that pasture receives no nutrients recycled back to it. And so that can create a few issues just in how you may need to fertilize and how you deal with the pasture maintenance. If you have real small animals like rabbits, you probably have them in cages, and the manure oftentimes just drops through the cage, and then you just kind of scrape it up, clean it up from underneath the cage. Typically that may either be stockpiled, it may be put in the trash can. If you have rabbit poop, it's actually fairly valuable. A lot of people really like it, so you can probably give it away or sell it. And from a waste management standpoint or an environmental standpoint, the only real issue with this is just that you want to make sure that you don't have water running into that waste under the cage, and that you don't have any runoff from that waste, those pellets leaving your property. So berms can do wonders at helping to prevent run-on and prevent runoff. If you have larger animals, horses, swine, cattle, or poultry, you may have them in a barn or a shed. Oftentimes you're going to have bedding in there with that, and you're most likely doing some manual cleaning, and then that manure is being hauled out. Most often it's stockpiled and maybe put into a bigger pile and composted, but usually it's just stockpiled somewhere. There's nothing wrong with that approach. The key here is just that you need to make sure that you don't have water running into that pile, and you don't have any water or leachate running off of that pile. And in our dry climate, dust from that pile can be an issue, especially for some of your neighbors downwindstream. Oops, sorry. And if you have corrals or dry lots or pens or sacrifice areas, typically you're just trying to keep them clean and dry. You're going to scrape them as you need, and that manure also is typically just piled. Again, the same thing. We're going to watch for runoff and dust from that pen and from that manure stockpile. Now, one thing to note, if you have your own well, please, please, please do not have your livestock corral area surrounding your well. Your well for your house should have a 100-foot buffer all the way around it. You don't want manure being able to leach down, and especially preferentially along the well casing, down into your groundwater. Now, how can we store our manure? Our stockpiles, very best is if we can have a pad underneath, like a concrete pad. Concrete pads with walls are wonderful. If you don't have that, that's not really a problem. You can place manure in a stockpile. They recommend that you rotate that location every year, and that you plant vegetation where that stockpile was for at least 3 years afterwards, because there's going to be nutrients that leach through that pile, and you're trying to utilize those nutrients before they leach down into our groundwater. With any manure stockpile, it's really important to make sure that we don't have water running into it. We don't want to create more volume and waste that we need to deal with, and we want to make sure that no runoff is getting there. Berms are probably one of our best friends. Walls on like a stockpile like this and berms are really good friends. If you have a little nicer system, you may have storage bins, and it may or may not have a cover. These work really, really well. Can work well if you want to also compost that manure. You can move the manure from one bin to the other. In that process, you're aerating it and helping that composting process. If the walls help contain that manure and help prevent a lot of runoff, they're typically going to be on a pad. And if you have a cover, then you don't have rain or snow adding moisture into them. So these can work really, really well. they are more expensive. So most people probably don't have this system. You may just have a manure compost area. And if you have just a few chickens, you may just want to have a small little bin. You typically need about 1 cubic yard to maintain enough heat, but that can be in rings or barrels, most anything. This one was built with using pallets for the sides. You may have larger piles or windrows. Windrows work really well. Again, you want to make sure that you don't have run on and run off. And if you're composting, you should be actively composting. That means actually turning that material, maintaining an aerobic process, and that requires maintaining enough moisture and monitoring the temperatures enough to make sure that you're getting there. If you just put it in a great pile and just leave it there, what some people refer to as cold composting, that's really technically not composting, that's decomposition. It's not truly composting, and you don't get some of the benefits of it. You don't get the pathogen reduction and the weed seed reduction in that. So location, where you're going to place that manure storage facility, you're going to need to look at where it is. How far is it from a stream or a pond or a well? That is going to vary tremendously by your state or your municipality. Typically a minimum of 100 feet. Many states have a 200 feet requirement. You need to check where you're at and what those ordinances are. They will also probably have requirements on the distances from neighbors. Very common is that you have to be at least 200 feet from any residence and 50 feet from the property line. You also should look at the slope of the ground. You don't want to put a manure storage pile or a storage area on ground that's sloped where you can end up with a lot of run on and run off. You may not have a perfectly flat area. You can use berms and buffer strips to help control run on and run off some. You should really think about the prevailing wind direction. At least here, the wind primarily comes from the west. And so you want to make sure that you're placing that manure pile so that it's not blowing directly into your neighbor's backyard. You want to think about that odor, the dust. And then as you're placing that, kind of think about what kind of pests can be around and if there's ways you can minimize pest access. And then please think about just the aesthetics, okay? You might be meeting all the regulations. You're 200 feet from a residence. You're 50 feet from the border, the boundary line. But if your neighbor's sitting in their backyard on their deck and looking at your manure pile, they are probably not happy. And that's going to create a problem. If you place it out in the front, if your house sits back from the road quite a ways and you place it out along the road, everybody that drives by it is probably going to be muttering that they don't want to just see a manure pile there. So please, please think about what it's going to look like. And one other thing for your manure piles, if you have a lot of winds or you have neighbors close and there's just no way that you can eliminate and not have it being, some odor going to your neighbors, planting trees or shrubs around it can help a lot. As the wind comes, as it hits those trees, it forces that wind up, and that helps carry a lot of those odors up and over, and that can help. That's one mitigation measure that you can use. Now, application, use, and disposal. First, remember that manure is a resource. We really want you to realize that manure is a resource. It's only if we don't utilize it appropriately that it's a problem. So manure can help build our soil and promote plant growth. It contains important nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, that our plants need in large quantities. It has a lot of micronutrients, and we won't get into all of those, but those are really good. That manure also has a lot of organic matter, and that can help our soil health. That organic matter helps our soil improve the nutrient holding capacity and improve the water holding capacity. Our Utah soils in general are extremely low in nutrients. And so it's very, very important that we can build that organic matter to help improve our soil. And manure is an excellent way to do that. So it can truly be a really, really good resource. You just have to use it appropriately. To do that, we should test both the soil and the manure, and it's really important to obtain a representative sample. And that's so that we know what nutrients we're dealing with. We should know for sure what nutrients we have in our manure. We need to know what the nutrient content of that soil is. And as you take that sample, you should follow the sampling guidelines. And there's guides that will be available from that link. And then keep those samples cold and send them in right away to be tested. Do not put your manure or soil sample in a bag and then throw it on the dashboard of your pickup truck and let that sit in the sun for a few days. That alters the nutrient content and you will not get accurate results. If you want to apply that manure to your property, you should apply it according to both the soil nutrients and the crop needs. You should make sure that you do not apply manure within 100 feet of a well or any water sources. And Utah laws require that we incorporate that manure within 3 days. Best is to incorporate it right after application. We lose about half of the nitrogen in that manure if we let it sit there for 3 days. If you are applying manure to a pasture, you are of course not going to incorporate it and till it in because we're not going to till up the pasture. If you can irrigate it a little bit, that can help get some of those nutrients into the soil better. And if you're thinking of applying manure in the winter, that is really not recommended. And do realize that it can be limited. If you have a high steep slope where you're applying it, or you're really close to irrigation ditches or water sources, winter application may not be allowed at all. And if you don't have enough land to apply that manure, so you have way more manure than you can use, there are a lot of people that will typically take it. Gardeners, landscapers, and farmers may be willing to take it. They're typically most interested in the actively composted manure. That's where you're turning it enough that you're keeping it aerated and getting it up to the right temperatures. And when we do that, we kill almost all of the weed seeds, we kill almost all of the pathogens, we reduce the odor tremendously, the fly population, it cooks the fly larvae, so you don't have flies in nearly the same number, and it reduces the volume of that manure by about half. If you were giving that away or selling it, you technically should give that person a manure test. Some probably depends really on how much you're doing, but that is really what is recommended by the state, is to provide a manure test to that person so they know the nutrient content and they can utilize that manure or compost appropriately. And then just one last thing, we have HPAI around, highly pathogenic avian influenza. This is really kind of a nasty little virus. It's decimating a lot of our poultry populations, and it is spread primarily by infected birds. And as they drop their fecal droppings, it's getting into like feed supplies or into places where other animals come into contact with it, and then it is spread around. If animals are infected, their manure will contain that virus. Dairy cows and poultry both get it. Poultry tend to die right away from it. Dairy cows will get sick a little bit, but they tend to recover. But that virus will be in their manure and it will be in their milk. And so you should only drink pasteurized milk at that, or realize that if you could be getting the HPAI virus in raw milk. And it's one good symptom for that there may be HPA around is the number of dead cats. If all of a sudden you start seeing a whole bunch of dead cats and you don't normally see a bunch of dead cats around, that may be a good indicator that there's HPAI around, and you should take extreme care. The things that we can do, we're trying to minimize the spread. So washing your hands, humans can also get HPAI. Make sure we wash our hands. We should clean and sanitize our boots and any equipment that we're using, and you should be changing your clothes. It's a kind of a nasty virus that spreads and transmits quite easily. And so it's one that we really should all work together to try to control. And good manure management can really help with some of that. So in summary, whether you have a little bit of manure or a lot, it's important that the manure is managed correctly. That's both to help prevent any environmental impacts and degradation, and we have regulations that try and help control that or enforce that. We want to minimize our health impacts. Manure can contain some nasty diseases, and so good practices can help minimize the health impacts. And then ultimately, we're really trying to utilize those nutrients in a beneficial manner. So if you can, you apply that manure to your garden or a field or something and utilize it, that's even better yet. And then please, please, please be considerate of your neighbors. Your neighbors, if your neighbors are unhappy and complaining to the city offices and to the state, it's going to make your life miserable. So really think about that. And, everyone can win if we just are courteous of everybody. So with that, I'll end this presentation. For more information, you can go to the Ag Waste Management site and then the Small Farms tab there. And there's a page that has a whole bunch of links that have some of this information and some additional information. And with that, feel free to call me and contact me at any time if you want. And I thank you very much. Let's see, other questions?
Thank you so much, Rhonda. We do have one question in the Q&A. Do you want me to read that to you?
Yeah, because I'm not getting it pulled up right now. I'm not sure.
It says, I have a large urban property with a couple of rabbits. Can I get certified as an organic manure source in order to sell the rabbit manure?
Ooh, that's a good question. My guess is you have to go check with the organic certification process because they're probably going to, I'm going to say I don't know that one. Sorry. But I would check with the organic certifiers and see if they have requirements on that. They may think you should feed them organic feed. And so that would be the big thing on that one.
Okay. That's the only question so far. If others, we have a few minutes. We actually don't start our next session for 7 more minutes. So if there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Maybe if you have a minute, Rhonda, what are your preferred, for thinking about application to gardens? If you're doing things on site, what would you say is like the preferred manure source?
Preferred manure source? That really depends on what your soil nutrients are. So realize that manure varies tremendously. Like poultry manure is really high in nitrogen relatively. Horse manure, low in nitrogen relatively. Poultry litter typically will have some of like the wood shavings, which may be problematic. So you might want to think about that. Depends on your situation, how you're planting it. Most manure can be really good. Just realize that if it's compost, that's even better yet. It minimizes the volume. The odors are already pretty well gone. That composting process greatly reduces the odors, minimizes the fly populations. So compost is truly the very best. If you're applying manure, incorporate it right away. That helps retain the nutrients and minimize odors and fly problems. And so a lot depends on your nutrient content of your soil. If you're really high in phosphorus, you're going to want to kind of watch a little bit what you're doing. So
what you're adding. Okay. And just so that everybody hears, as Rhonda was speaking, I did put a link in the chat for everyone to see that took us to the USU Soil Analytics Lab, where you can get soil and manure tested. So take a look at that. We do have a bunch of questions that have come up. If my chickens keep getting a sour crop, is this caused by possible poor manure management?
What do you mean by a sour crop? Can they explain?
So this might be it's a ailment in the chickens itself. This might be a better question to ask when we have a backyard chickens presentation a couple of sessions from now. So let's Jay Anderson, let's hold that question. Shirley asks, is there a good way to connect manure producers with small farmers for maybe delivery perhaps?
So I know there's been, at least historically, there's been some farmers that will compost their manure and then sell it if they live close to an urban area. Social media might be a great way. Some states actually have whole little exchanges online. And so, but I don't know specifically in Utah which ones we do.
Okay. Here's I think a quick one. I think other than rabbit manure, we cannot use other manures fresh. Is that correct? So can you apply rabbit manure right on your plants and gardens?
You can apply when you have the plants growing, I guess. If you can apply any manure fresh. If you're applying it to like lettuce and leafy crops, you don't want to be applying that when that plant is growing. You can apply it fresh beforehand, incorporate it, and then plant, and that's just fine. And you can, it's probably more a matter of if it's for human. If it's for human consumption, you're going to want to watch that a little bit, just that you can have those pathogens. But if it's a crop growing beneath the ground, it's the reality is you're probably going to be fine because it's going to take a while, and the sun and the UV lights and stuff is going to kill off most of those pathogens.
I think the question was also meaning, and I may have the terminology wrong, but I've always heard like you can't put that on because it's too hot. It'll burn your plants if you put the manure on directly. So if I cleaned out my chicken coop and tossed it on my garden beds and I planted next month.
No, that it really depends on how much you apply. It's
Okay.
not. So my mother-in-law had a neighbor that came and helped and put a foot of manure on her garden area. Took about 3 years. That, too much. Little amounts, no problem.
Okay.
But you do want to watch for pathogens on some of the leafy vegetables and stuff like that.
Okay. And there's a comment here saying we put it on in the spring, putting manure on in the spring. Is that what you would recommend?
Spring is really good. Fall can also work. If you're incorporating it, it's fine. Just make sure you get it incorporated. That's the big thing. So typically you're either going to apply it in the spring before you plant, or you can apply it in the fall after you've removed the crops and then incorporate it until it ends.
Okay. I'm going to do one more question, Rhonda, and then I'm going to ask you to answer these others in the Q&A while I get the next presentation up. So is it okay to spread manure from a corral or bedding spot to an area without a lot of vegetation, or will it generate weeds?
Raw manure, if you want to incorporate it, that's fine. But then realize that if you don't have anything really growing and if you aren't going to plant anything, you're not going to be utilizing those nutrients well. And so long term, you need to watch, what you're doing to that. But I forget the question here. What was it?
And I had said that it was answered. So it was about putting it into areas without vegetation. Are you going to be promoting weeds?
Your manure will have weed seeds most likely. Depends on the feed that they're getting. But even so, if you get certified or weed-free hay and things, that's going to greatly reduce it, but that still doesn't mean that you can't have weed seeds in it. There can still be some. So that's why a lot of people don't like raw manure, is that it has weed seeds in it.
Okay.